Welcome to Lesson 11 of the Ruby on Rails tutorial screencasts, User Microposts, which builds the first of two features necessary for a minimalist Twitter-style application. We saw a sketch of microposts in Lesson 2, and in this lesson we'll make a full-strength version of the micropost resource, associating it with the user model using the hasMany and belongs_to methods, and then making the forms and partials needed to manipulate and display the results. In the next and final lesson, we'll complete our sample app by giving each user a feed of microposts based on the users they follow. We'll get started by making a data model for microposts. As with the micropost model in Lesson 2, this data model will include validations and an association with the user model. But unlike that data model, the one we make in this lesson will be fully tested and will also have default ordering and automatic destruction if the parent user is destroyed. Let's make a topic branch for microposts. Let's take a look at a diagram of the micropost data model. The first field here is the ID, which comes for free in Rails. We saw this in the context of the user model as well. The next field is the content field. This is what will contain the actual content of the micropost, which will actually be limited to 140 characters. So technically we could use a string, which on most systems can hold 255 characters. But the entry field for this content, as we saw in Lesson 2, is a text area. And so this is more naturally thought of as a text field in that context. This also gives us some flexibility. If we decide to relax the restriction of 140, it'll be easy to accommodate that choice. And finally, there's no performance difference between text and string in the context of a PostgreSQL database, which is what we're using in production. The next field is a user ID. In the context of database modeling, this is known as a foreign key. This is an integer that identifies the user this micropost belongs to. And then finally, we have these magic columns created at and updated at that we get automatically by running a Rails migration. Speaking of which, let's make that migration. We'll actually do it as part of generating a model. You may recall from Lesson 6 that generating a model automatically generates a migration. So the model is micropost, remember singular for models. And then we can add the content, which is text, remember. And then we could do this. We could do user ID integer, just following the diagram here. But there's actually a way to tell Rails that we want this to be an association by doing this. We can omit the ID part and just say user : references. Let's take a look at the migration that made. You can see here t.text content and our timestamps here that come for free. That's created at and updated at. These guys here. But then we've got t.references user, and you can see that it puts an index on it automatically. Remember in Lesson 6, we put an index on the email attribute of the user model. In that context, our immediate motivation was to enforce email uniqueness at the database level, but as a side effect, we also got efficient lookup when we did find by email. And that's why this is here automatically. Anytime you have an association, it's going to be required to find by this user ID here. So Rails automatically puts in an index. There's actually a second thing I want to do here, though, related to indices. We're not just going to be finding microposts with a particular user ID. We also want to order them by the time they were created. So that means that we want to include created at in an index, and there's a way to include both of them in a single index. So I'm going to add index on microposts and then give it a hash of symbols corresponding to the attributes. Because we're going to be finding by both of these attributes, we can put them together to form what's called a multiple key index. Save that and run the migration. We'll get started by writing a couple of tests for the kind of behavior we expect from the micropost model. Let's take a look at that here. Let's open the user test too, just to remind ourselves what it looks like. Remember, with users, we started with this basic sanity check. This test should be valid. So let's do the same thing over here. Of course, it's a micropost here. That means we need a setup method. And then we'll just put in micropost here, at micropost. Start off with just that. And let's fire up our guard window here. And if we save this here, it should be green. Now let's add a test for the presence of the user ID, without which none of the data modeling will work. So test user ID should be present. And then to do this, we want to set the micropost user ID to nil, but of course it doesn't even have the user ID right now, so let's change that. That suggests introducing a user. Just pull it out of the fixtures. Now we can do this kind of assignment directly, but this is not idiomatically correct, and we're going to refactor this in just a few minutes. But for now, this will be fine. So now that we've set that user ID, let's do this. Set it to nil. And then say it should not be valid. That should go red. Right, so let's add the validation. By the way, you might note here that there's a belongs to user line that we did not put in by hand. That was created automatically by Rails generate model because of the user references line we put in. We'll see the result of this in a couple of minutes, but first let's put in the validation. So validates user ID, presence true. Should go green. All right. Now we'd also like to validate the presence of the content. Certainly blank content is invalid. We don't want to put that in there yet though. Let's do the test first. The content should be present, so let's do, I'm going to make a mistake here actually, so let's do content here. Content equals, let's just make it blank. Save it. Remember, I haven't saved this window over here. In fact, we can do this here. Save it again. You think, oh, it should be red. That's right, because we just added a failing test. Now let's put in the validation. Validates content. Presence true. Now we think, oh, we should go green. But we didn't. And the reason is because now this test should be valid has failed right here. And that's because this micropost in the setup method doesn't have any content. The reason we added this sanity check test, just to make sure that the setup micropost is valid, was exactly to catch this sort of little mistake. So let's put in the content. All right, now we're green. And finally, we want these to be microposts. That is to say, we want them to be small. So let's put a length constraint of 140 characters, just following Twitter's convention. So let's say test content should be at most 140 characters. Now you might remember that we had to solve this same kind of problem before in the user model. We had a test like this. Here's the maximum length of the name, and we just use this string multiplication. So let's do the same thing here. Let's say A times 140, 141, so it's a maximum of 140. So that's red, and then we can put in the same sort of length validation here. Length of maximum of 140. All right, now that we've got these basic validations in place, let's take a look at the user micropost associations. Let's take a look at some diagrams of the relationship between the two. All right, this is the association between microposts and users. Because of this belongs to, we saw this here, each micropost knows which user it belongs to. And the way that happens is by associating the user ID with the ID of the corresponding user, and then the code to pull that user out is micropost.user. So this is the associated user here. Going the other way, we can talk about how a user has many microposts. And here the ID of the user is used to find the associated microposts based on the value of user underscore ID. And the way we access this list is using the code user.microposts. These associations give rise to a bunch of useful methods. Let's take a look at some of them. We've just talked about micropost.user and user.microposts, but the associations also give us these, user.micropost.create and createBang. This lets us create a micropost through the association. And then we also have user.micropost.build and user.micropost.findBy. This build here is the analog of new in that it doesn't actually create the record in the database, rather it just creates it in memory. What's cool about these methods here is that they let us create new microposts, either in memory or in the database, with the user ID automatically filled in. In other words, we don't have to specify the user ID explicitly, rather the ID is inferred using the association. To get this to work, we need has many and belongs to in the models, and half of the work has already been done for us. As I mentioned before, because of user::references in the model generation, it's here. Because of this, Rails knew to put belongs to user here, so all we need is the corresponding has many microposts in the user model. I like to put the associations right at the top. Has many microposts. That ran some tests. Let's take a look at it. Still green. Just resave it just to see. And at this point, we're in a position to understand why this code here is not idiomatically correct. You can see this explicitly specifies the user, or rather the user ID, but now we know there's a better way to do that. We can do it through the association like this. We saw here user.micropost.build. So this is @user.microposts.build. And then we can get rid of this part here. Save it, should still be green. In the process, of course, we've actually tested that @user.micropost is working. So if we got rid of this here, this will still be green because this isn't part of the user model test, but if we rerun the micropost test, now it's red because @user.micropost isn't valid anymore. So let's get rid of this, uncomment that, go green again. Great, now let's rerun the whole test suite just to make sure we're green. In fact, I don't think we've run it yet. Great. Before moving on to building the web interface for microposts, there are a couple of refinements I'd like to add to the model. These are exactly the sort of details that we punted on before, but now it's important to include them. One of the defining features of a list of microposts is that they come out in a specific order. In particular, they come out most recent first. But by default, this @user.micropost does not guarantee any order. In fact, it might be the right order, but we shouldn't rely on that fact. So let's set a test for what we want this to be. Say order should be most recent first, and then let's plan to make a fixture micropost called most recent. So let's do this, assert equal and this requires adding some fixtures for the microposts. We'll add a few while we're at it. Note that I'm putting the created at column in by hand here. This is what allows us to control the order. Ordinarily, you can't set the created at column, but inside fixtures you can. So let's say that this first one, this orange, was created 10 minutes ago. And then one of my favorite status updates, this is the town manifesto. A little bit of anti-pi propaganda. And I created that actually 3 years ago or so. And this is one of my favorite cat videos. Of course, ordinarily I would just paste that URL in. Here we go. Let's say it was created 2 hours ago, and then this is the one we want, most recent. This is our status update. Our micropost here is we're writing a short test. Let's say that was created at now. So by virtue of setting these created at values explicitly, we've guaranteed that this will be the most recent. So we can save that. This might actually pass. Let's take a look. No, it fails, so that's good. It's really nice to be able to get to red. It's really hard to arrange this unless you actually manipulate this created at column. So which one came out first? Yeah, so you can see the sad cats came out first. That's kind of weird. Who knew? So this is great. We've got a red test. Now we're ready to define the standard order. The way we're going to do this is with what's called a scope. Scope is actually a fairly general concept, but the only thing we'll need is something called default scope. Let's put it right after the belongs to user. Now, the argument of the default scope is a procedure that tells Rails how to order it. So the way to do that is to use this strange looking arrow syntax. Let me show you how that works. This is what's called a proc, spelled like that if you want to Google it. So let's give this proc a block that just prints out foo. You can see that returns a proc here. This is essentially an anonymous function. It's a function that doesn't have a name, but we can call it like this, .call. So the argument here is going to be order. Well, let's look at the default, the easiest way to do the order. Ordinarily, you could just give it a symbol like this, order created at. Let's go back here. You may think, well, this is the right order, right? We want the order in which they were created, but no, that's still red. And this is because order by created at actually returns the one that was created longest ago first, but we want the most recent one. So the default order here is created at ascending, but what we actually want is created at descending. This requires pushing down to little raw SQL. It's created at descending. It's actually case insensitive, but the convention is to put SQL keywords in all caps. Let's save that and see if it works. Great. By the way, I mentioned this stuff about procs. This is pretty advanced stuff, so if this is confusing, don't worry about it. Just know that when you define a scope like this, you need to put inside this block, after the arrow, a method that specifies the behavior of the scope. In this case, ordering created at descending, which, as we've just seen with the passing test, returns most recent first. Now, I've just learned from an Alert Rails tutorial reader that as of Rails 4, we can actually replace this raw SQL with pure Ruby using a key value pair. So we can do created at colon and then make this a symbol. So this has the same effect. It's still nice to see that we can use raw SQL, but I definitely prefer to use pure Ruby if possible. So let's save that and see if we're still green. There we go. So there will be a little switch back to the old version because this is a quick insert into the screencasts. But this is definitely the syntax I recommend using. The second refinement we're going to implement is to destroy microposts associated with any users that are destroyed. Remember that admins can destroy users, so it makes sense to destroy the associated microposts. Let's take a look at that here. In this case, the application code is really simple, so I'm going to implement it first and then write a test. So the way to do it is just to add this one little bit to has many microposts. We say dependent destroy. Save that. Should still be green. Now let's write a test. This is on the user model now. So we can say that the associated micropost should be destroyed. That requires associating a micropost with the user defined in setup. It's this here. And remember, this is just created in memory, so first we need to save it to the database. Then we can create an associated micropost and destroy the user and make sure that that changes the micropost count by 1. So let's do that. We can create this through the association. And I'd like to use create bang in this context just to raise an error in case anything goes wrong. And then we can use our assert difference assertion. Micropost.count by -1. And then at user.destroy. Save that and see if we're red. Oh no, we should be green, right? Yeah. So now we can test that by this. Go red and green. Great. We're not quite done with the micropost data model. We'll be adding a couple more things when we talk about uploading images later in this lesson, but for now this is a great start, and certainly enough to let us move on to building the web interface for creating, showing, and destroying microposts. We'll start by writing the code needed to show microposts. Rather than putting a particular user's microposts on a separate micropost index page, instead we'll follow Twitter's lead and put the microposts on the user's profile page. Let's take a look at a mock-up of that. Here's the profile page with the gravatar, name, and then a list of the microposts with pagination and a count of the number of microposts. So these are the elements we want to add in this section. Let's start with the code to render microposts. As with users, we're going to define a micropost partial. Remember how that works here. We've got app, views, users, and then we have underscore user.html.erb. We're going to define the analog of this for microposts. That means we need a micropost directory here in the views, and the easiest way to get that is to generate the micropost controller. So let's do that here. Remember, controllers are plural. That didn't generate any views, but we can add a view here. Let's open that up. This will be similar to user. Let's take a look at that. Just do this. We'll have an li, but in this case we're going to give it an ID as well. This is useful especially because microposts are coming out in a specific order, and this also opens up the possibility of testing the microposts and maybe even manipulating them with JavaScript. This isn't strictly necessary, but it's a good idea. So we want to give it the ID of the micropost, so we can just use embedded Ruby like this. Micropost.id. We can't do just ID by itself. We couldn't do this because you actually can't start CSS IDs with an integer. So we put micropost dash to make it valid. And then let's link to the gravatar. You can look at the mockup here. I'll link to the gravatar for the user. Now you might wonder where this micropost is going to come from here. Remember the way that this partial works over here with this user partial is that we called it using render at users. That's from the user's index. Right, we have render at users. Because this partial is named user and this is a collection of things with class user, there's automatically a local variable called user. That means we're going to be able to do something like this, render at micropost. And then inside here, there will automatically be a micropost variable. And we can get the user associated with that micropost using micropost.user. So we can do link to gravatar for micropost.user. Let's make it size 50, a little smaller than the default. And then the link should go to the profile page, which is just user path of user, in this case, user path of micropost.user. But as usual, we can omit this part and just link right to the user. If we look at our mockup, you can see we want the content and then how long ago it was posted. And for simplicity, I also want to include the user's name with a link, because that will let us reuse this on the feed. Let's do that here. Let's put this inside a span. Let us style it. And the content will also go into span with class content. Remember, this is escaped out automatically, so anything dangerous in this content will be escaped out and rendered harmless. And then we want to put how long ago it was posted. Give it a timestamp class. And this is a really cool Rails helper. Posted time ago in words. Give it a timestamp, and that's micropost.createdAt. Posted time ago in words ago. Save that. Now let's write the code to display the micropost. It's going to go on the show page. Show page for users, so this is just the profile page. So after this aside here, I'm going to put a div. This is a bootstrap class. And now let's say if there are any microposts, put in a header, setter here with the count, and then display the microposts. Here we're using the association again, if at user.microposts. .any question mark. To put in an h3. And the count. By the way, this count is done in the database. Rails doesn't pull all the microposts out of the database and then see how long the resulting collection is. This is actually really efficient. It's done right in the database. This is also the reason that count and length are different for paginated objects. Remember, we saw in a previous lesson that length returned the length of the actual collection, but count returned all of them, just the total number in the database. So here, we're going to see that at user.micropost is going to be paginated. We can get this sort of count here by using at user.micropost.count. Now we need to render the microposts. Because they come out in a particular order, I'm going to use an ordered list with the class microposts. And here we can use this trick, render at microposts. This requires a collection called at microposts. We'll define that in a moment, but first I want to note that we also want to paginate them. Remember here, we want pagination here at the bottom, so that's will paginate. Look at the index. Before we just did will paginate by itself. What this does is looks for an instance variable corresponding to the class of the controller we're in. So in this case, this is the user's controller. So it's looking for a variable called @users, which is in fact defined in the user's controller. Right, that's here, @users equals user.paginate. But here, we're actually still in the user's controller, right? This is the user show page. So in this case, we need to tell will paginate explicitly which collection to paginate, in this case, at micropost. So then over here in the show page, we can do this. Instead of doing @user.micropost, we can do @user.micropost.paginate page of params of page. So it's just like this here, except now we're going through the association. Rails and will paginate are so designed that this will just work, which is really cool. So let's take a look at it. Save this, and go to the user show page. And there's the user profile page, but there aren't any microposts, of course, because we're not showing them if there aren't any, right here, and there aren't any. To fix this problem, as with users, we're going to create some sample microposts using our seeds script. It would actually take quite a while to generate microposts for all 100 users here. There's 99 plus the first one there. So we're just going to create microposts for the first 6. Especially since we want enough microposts to trigger pagination. So what we're going to do is create 50 microposts just for the first 6 users. Let's pull those users out of the database. And I want them in the order that they were created here in the seeds file. So I'm going to say user.order created at. Remember we saw with the micropost model that this returns the oldest ones first, so we had to reverse it in that case, but in this case that's what we want. And then we can just take the first 6. So the take method takes the first 6 from that list. Now at this point we could iterate through each of these users like this, and then create the micropost here, but that would create big runs of, in this case, 50 microposts. And as we'll see in the next lesson, when we make the feeds, we're going to want the different users to be interleaved. So it's actually more convenient to iterate first 50 times. And then inside here, for each user, create a micropost. I'm going to create bang, just to make sure any errors are caught immediately. Close this off. And now we have to give it some content. I'm going to define a local variable inside this block. We'd like this content to be something that doesn't distract us from the design, but that has some variation. We saw up here that we used the Faker gem to create names, and it turns out Faker also has the ability to create lorem ipsum text. And in this case, let's make it a sentence of length 5. Save that and reset our database. Actually, let's do it here. We have to shut down the server typically. First reset, and then we'll seed. All right, let's restart the web server and see what that did for us. All right, all the microposts appear to be there. We've got the link, we've got the lorem ipsum text, the gravatar is working. We even have pagination. So it looks like this partial that we defined is actually working. Of course, the styling is a little crazy, so let's add some CSS. There's quite a bit. In fact, the CSS I'm going to include here is all the CSS we need for this lesson. So I'm just going to paste it in. Here we go. Save that. You can just take a look at the structure if you want. You can see we're styling the li here, the list item. There's the user and content classes, the timestamp class, and the gravatar class. Let's take a look. Aha, much better. Looks like everything is working here. We can even look at a second user here. Let's look at 5. This is user 5. Pagination, as we saw before, is working, so it's still working. The CSS, of course, didn't change that. Great. Now that this is working, let's add an integration test for the user profile page. We already have a test that the profile page basically renders. Let's recall that. User show page. Let's just put an exception in here. See if that breaks something. Great, we actually have 2 errors there, indicating that if anything goes horribly wrong on this page, we're already covered. But now that we've put some more structure on the user show page, let's write a specific integration test for things like the title, the presence of a gravatar, and the presence of pagination, as well as the presence of the content of each micropost. We can start like this. Let's call it the user's profile test. Let's open that up. And let's just go down the list of things we want. Well, we definitely want a user. And so let's just pull that out of the fixtures. And let's test the profile display. Oops, sometimes that end appears and sometimes it doesn't. I still haven't figured that out. All right, well first let's get that path, that user, and sort of template users slash show. Let's go here. I like saving it incrementally here. And let's get the title. So it's the title tag, and then we want the title to be the user's name combined with the base title. So that's and then like this. Oh, in fact, we need to get rid of this raise, don't we? We're still red there. Okay, what failed there? Oh, that's right. This goes first. It used to be the other way. But you may recall that we have a helper for this. It's in the application helper. It's a full title helper. So we can actually just add that here. We can include application helper. And then just do full title here. Something to be careful of if you do something like this is to make sure to add independent tests for the helper that you're using, because otherwise you could put a typo in here and it would still pass. Right, so we've now introduced an error into the title, but there's nothing here to indicate that. If we rerun the whole test suite, though, we'll see we are red. That's because we hard-coded the title into some of these other places. On the static pages controller test, we've hard-coded Ruby on Rails tutorial sample app. So if you wanted to use this full title helper everywhere, which I do recommend, then you would want to write some specific tests for the application helper, in particular the full title helper. Writing such a test is left as an exercise, so if you get the solutions manual, you'll be able to see the test that I recommend. But in any case, this is working fine now. Let's save this. Just make sure we're green. Good. Next, we can check for a top-level heading in H1 containing the name and the gravatar. So let's do that. So we can do H1 and then text name as at user.name. And then we can also make sure the gravatar is there like this. We can do H1, and then inside the H1 should be an image tag with class equal to gravatar. So you can see if we change this up, now it fails. So this angle bracket here, this greater than sign, indicates that this image.gravatar should be inside the H1. This is about as detailed as I would ever make an HTML test. I'm pretty sure that I want an H1 on this page, but this is the sort of thing that if you find that you're over-specifying it, you should change the test to be less specific. So what else do we want? Now we're getting to the micropost part. Let's make sure the micropost count is on the page, this here. We want it to be the right count too, so let's do... Now all we care about is that this be somewhere on the page. So there's a really nice, powerful way to do that. This is a way not to specify the specific HTML tag being used. Instead, we can just say it appears somewhere in the body of the page. I say body there, it's actually just the full text of the page. This is assert match. We're going to put in the count. Count. And we want to convert it to a string. So it should appear somewhere. And there's this response object available inside of tests. And response.body, despite its name, is not in fact just the body of the page. It's in fact the entire HTML. Save that and run it. We're still green. That's good. And now we want to verify that pagination is being invoked. And remember, we did this before. So in the user's index test, you can see we tested for a div with class equal to pagination. So we can do that same thing here. In fact, let's just copy it. I actually cut it accidentally, but then I could just undo and then it still works. Same thing as copy. And save that, and now we're red. So why are we red? Because this was passing, right? The count worked fine. And the answer is because the number of microposts is currently not big enough in the test database to invoke pagination. Remember, we've got the fixtures file here, but there are only 4 of them. And pagination is invoked by default at 30. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the users. Remember, we added 30 users to invoke pagination. So we can do the same thing here. Let's do micropost n. And we want the content to be lorem ipsum text. Do faker. Actually, let's do this here. And we want the created at to be long enough ago that it will never be most recent. So let's just make it quite a few days ago. Save that and see how we did. It's not going to pass. See if you can figure out why. It's still failing, and the reason is because even though now there are enough microposts to invoke pagination, in fact the user still doesn't have any microposts. And that's because, as you may have noticed before when I created these, none of these microposts has a user ID. Now it is possible to add a user ID directly, like this, but then in users.yaml we would need to specify an ID as well, like this. And that's really annoying. Happily, Rails has anticipated this problem, and it's possible to create associations using fixtures. So the way to do that is like this. Instead of user ID, we just say user Michael. In this case, Rails will look for a user with key Michael and just make the association automatically. So let's give the same user to all of these microposts. Now it should work. Let's go over here and save it again. Great. Now that we know that pagination is being invoked, let's check to make sure that the content of each micropost appears on the page. We're going to use the same assert match trick here that we use in this line. So we want to paginate this. First page dot each do micropost, and we want to assert match micropost.content and then the response body. You can see that it's really nice that we were able to use the faker gem inside here, because if we hard-coded this, each micropost would have the same content and this test wouldn't be very good. But because in general these sentences will be different, it's a good test. Alright, this is a pretty sensitive test for the user profile page without being too specific about the HTML structure. So the next step is to actually be able to manipulate microposts through the web instead of relying purely on generated sample data. We'll get started with creating and destroying microposts by editing the routes file. Let's add some routes for this micropost resource. And we're going to add only create and destroy. Note that we haven't added routes for the new or edit pages, and that's because we're going to manipulate microposts through the user homepage and profile page rather than using separate micropost views. Let's get started on the interface by defining some access control in the micropost controller test. I should save this here. Both the create and destroy actions should be protected. In particular, they should require logged in users, so let's set that up. Let's just use the first of these fixtures. Remember, here they are. Just using this one here. And as with the analogous test for users, let's do that. Users controller test. So remember, we did this here. Let's look for assert no difference. Here it is. So we're just going to make the analog of these two. Although actually it's just the analog of this one here for the create action and for the destroy action. So let's try that. insert no difference in the micropost count. And that's if we post to create. And we have to give it the right parameters here so that the route resolves. And we should probably redirect to the root URL here. This is the standard place we redirect when someone tries to do something they shouldn't. This is the same thing here, except I'm going to issue a delete request. And that needs an ID, which is just the micropost. Remember, Rails converts this to the corresponding ID. So let's save that and take a look at our tests. Right, they should both be red. And actually, the error here indicates a failure to generate the route. I'm a little surprised by that. Oh, and that's because of this post. It should be a delete request. Oh, it should be delete destroy. Right, there we go. Yeah, so now these are the errors I was expecting, namely that it can't find the destroy action or the create action. Good. So let's define those. Should be a different error. Right now it's missing the template, it says. But of course we really want to redirect, so we can just put a filter in here. Now we did this before, remember, in the user's controller. We have this before action logged in user. So we basically want the same line here, except instead of these four, we just want create and destroy in this line here, the list of actions being protected. We save that though. Now it's going to complain that we don't have this before filter in the micropost controller. And that's true. It's defined down here. It's defined in the user's controller. And that was fine before, that we only needed it in the user's controller, but now we also need it here. And indeed, this filter is potentially generally useful, so let's move it from here to the controller that's the base class of all controllers, namely the application controller. If we put it in here, then because of inheritance, because of this line here, and this line here, it will automatically be available here in the micropost controller. So let's save this here, save, save, and we should be green. Oh, looks like there's one error. Oh, look at that. I still have this error here. I forgot to fix that typo. I told you it's really important to have independent tests of that helper. So let's do that. There we go. In this case, the error got caught because there's this hard coding, but this is why if you're going to eliminate this duplication by using the full title helper in all the tests, it's essential to write an independent test to catch this sort of thing. So it should be hard coded at least one place in the tests. So let's save this, close this up, and rerun the test suite. Now 2 failures. Oh, and this is because there's actually an error in the test. In fact, logged in user redirects to the login URL, which is fine. That's the right behavior. There we go. Now we're ready to write the interface to create new microposts. Let's take a look at a mock-up. Our plan is to put this form on the home page. So at the upper left, we expect some information about the user, and then this text area with a button to create the micropost. Let's write the create action first. can take a look at the user's controller, just to remind ourselves how we do this. So here are the steps. First, we need to create a new micropost in analogy with this line here. And now instead of doing micropost.new, we're going to do current user.micropost.build. Remember our table here. This is the way that we create a new user in memory. This is the analog of user.new over here. But now we go through the association, and of course the user in question is the current user that's logged into the session. As with users, instead of giving it a params hash, we're going to give it strong parameters, in this case called micropost params. And then we need to define it, just like we did over here. User params, just copy this here. Actually, we can copy the private part too. Here we go. And then it will be params.require micropost permit content. That's the only thing we're permitted to edit through the web, is the content. So let's go back up to the create action. Now we can say if at micropost.save, it's the same thing. Let's give it a flash message. Redirect to the home page, else we want to re-render the home page with some error messages. Now, as we'll see, we'll be able to reuse the error messages partial, so the error messages will happen automatically, so we just need to render the home page, which is at static pages home. So this is our best guess at the back end. Now let's write the front end. It's going to be on the home page. And now we're going to actually change the home page depending on whether the user is logged in or not. So this stuff here will be for non-logged in users. That means we can do this. And in this section, we can put in the code for logged in users. So let's do this. Tab it over. If logged in, else. Now, I don't like having this much content in the two branches. We're going to have quite a bit here, and then there's all this stuff here. In general, I would define partials for these, but that's fairly straightforward and is left as an exercise. All right, let's look at the mockup again. There are basically two things we need to render. We need this user information here in the upper left, and then the form for creating new microposts. So let's put those in partials preemptively. Let's make a row and an aside. Again, these are bootstrap classes. And there are two sections in the aside. We're going to put the user information in a section with class user info, and let's render a partial. We might potentially use this partial on multiple places in the application, including multiple controllers. So let's put it in the shared directory. And then the second section will be class micropost form. That's this here. Again, these class names are arbitrary, but if you look at the CSS that we pasted in earlier, it has styles for these classes. We'll put that in a micropost form partial. Let's define those partials now. App views shared. let's make the other one while we're at it. Okay, if we look at the mockup, we've got a gravatar, name, a link to the profile, and the number of microposts. So let's do that. This is the gravatar for the current user. Let's make it size 50. And that's going to be a link to the user path of the current user, so we can just say current user. And then let's make this an H1. Top level heading, which is the name of the user. Oops, I need to put this inside an embedded Ruby. And then let's use spans for the profile link and the number of microposts. So again, I need to put it inside embedded Ruby. Now it would be tempting to put current user.micropost.count here, like this. This would match the mockup, right? 50 microposts. But what if there's only one micropost? Then you'll get one micropost. We saw the solution to this before. It's the pluralize method. We used it here in the error messages partial. This form contains pluralize the count and then the word to be pluralized. So we can apply the same idea here. Pluralize the count, and the word is micropost. That's the kind of thing, if you're feeling ambitious, you can write a test for. And let's look at the micropost form. This is a form for a micropost. Form variable f. And let's put in a div of class field. And this is now f.textArea. Corresponding to the content. And then we need a submit button. Say post. And this requires, this app micropost requires that there be a micropost instance variable on the page. So let's look at this. This is on the static pages controller. This is in the home page, so we need a micropost here. So the way we would normally do this if it were just by itself would be to do micropost.new, but remember we have an association, so we can say current user.microposts.build. This is just a new micropost. It doesn't need to be initialized with content because that's what we're going to do here. We're going to submit content. But we do only want to define this if the user is logged in. All right, let's see the status of this. Let's save these. Save. Save. Let's go to the home page. All right, we have an error. There's no user. Where is this? Let's see here. Is it in here? Oh, it shouldn't say current user.user. It should say current user.name. Save that. Try it again. Ah, there we go. This is a good start. Let's see what happens if we submit it. That's even the right behavior, but you'll notice that there were no error messages displayed. I'm also curious to see if this form control class does anything here. So this is something like one of the new pages, new sessions. We had class form control. Let's see what that does here. The micropost form, text area content, class form control. That gives it a rounded view. I actually preferred the other one though. So let's keep it the way it was. I also don't like the size. Remember how we rendered the errors before. If we're here on, say, the new user page, where is it? Remember we had render shared error messages. So let's copy that. Let's go over to the error messages partial. So we want to change this so that it applies to different kinds of objects. So let's just see what happens if we put object here instead of @user. Can do this, pluralize object.errors.count. Save that and go over here and give it a local variable. Render the error messages partial with object equal to the parent object of the form, so that's f.object. So this form variable here knows which kind of object it is. So if we save this, take a look again. Oh, we still have @user in there, don't we? Yeah, it's right here. Let's try that again though. This should work. Yeah, now we've got an error here. The form contains one error, content can't be blank. There's one more refinement I want to add. It's nice to have a little placeholder text here in the box indicating what should go there. And there's a convenient way to do that using this helper here, the text area helper. We can just give it a key value pair placeholder and then the string that we want put in there. Check that out. Actually, let's just go here. Great, compose new micropost. This will actually work. I can click post here. But of course I get redirected back to the same page and it doesn't show me the micropost. We're going to fix that up in a moment, but we can look here. You can see on the profile, it actually did work right here. We'll fix that issue by putting a proto feed on this page. In the next lesson it will be a real feed, but it will be nice to have a first cut so that when we do submit a new micropost it appears right away. We'll do that in a second, but there's actually something wrong with the application. You might suspect it. You can run our test suite. In fact, you can see the tests have already run. 5 errors there. Rerun them. This is exactly the kind of change, this thing I made in the error messages partial, that's really dangerous. And it's hard to track down all the different places that it affects. But what's great about the test suite is that it'll tell us all those places. And in particular, it'll tell us when we're done. So what's happening here is that all of the places where the error messages partial was used before are now breaking. So let's look at that. Let's look in here, the new page. This needs a different kind of object. This should be, well, it's the same thing. It should be f.object. But in this case, it's going to be a user object instead of a micropost object. I can save that. Now there's only one error. It's an improvement. Now we can see the edit page has the same problem. All right, that's green. Let's rerun the whole suite. Ah, still one more spot. The last place here is the password resets edit template. So let's look at that. And indeed, this is a form for an @user. You do the same thing, object, f.object. And now the test suite should be green. Great. We're pretty deep into the development of this application at this point, and we've developed a really good test suite. So the kind of changes we're making are exactly the kind of changes you would make with a more mature application, where you say, oh, well, we've got this error messages partial we made for users, but now we want to use it for microposts. But it's really scary to make these sorts of changes without a test suite to catch all these little places where things might have gone wrong. All right, I just mentioned this issue that on the home page, it would be really nice to display a proto feed, just a first cut of this micropost feed that we'll develop in the next lesson, so that when you post a new micropost, it appears on this page right away. Let's look at a mock-up of where we're going with that. So this is the idea, that we have the same things we had on the previous mock-up, just this user information area and the micropost text area. And then here we've got a micropost feed with paginated feed items. Since it's users that have feeds, that suggests creating a feed method on the user model. Just going to put that down here. We'll just call it feed. And then for now, we'll just return all of the microposts for the current user. So that's micropost.where user ID equals the ID of the current user. This is the first time we've seen the where function. This is a really useful function for issuing SQL queries. And this question mark here escapes out anything that gets inserted. Making sure to always use this question mark when you want to insert information into this query automatically avoids a critical vulnerability called SQL injection, sometimes called SQL injection. In this case, the ID is just an integer, so it doesn't really matter. But it's a good idea to be completely consistent because then you'll never be vulnerable. By the way, you might notice that this is essentially equivalent to saying this. Remember, we have user.micropost, so this is really self.micropost. But inside this user model, we can omit self. The reason I wrote micropost.where is because this formulation here generalizes more nicely to the full feed in the next lesson. So let's do this here, save it. Then on the home page, we need to have a list of these feeds. We should paginate them too, so let's go to the home template here. Actually, no, we want the user's controller, don't we? There are too many tabs here. This is a sign that there are too many tabs. Here we are. Oh, and in fact, I was still wrong. We want the static pages controller. That's where the home page is, right? The home action. Okay, so now we want to define an instance variable that has the items in the feed so that we can then put them on the home page as mocked up here. So let's call that @feedItems. Should only happen if users logged in, so let's do this. We just defined feed, so current user.feed should work, and we want to paginate them. Oops. And let's make a feed partial on the home page. We can do that here. Save that and go here. And after the micropost form, it's actually outside of the aside, right? This stuff here is in the aside, so we want a div. And then let's make it an H3. Doesn't matter too much. Let's render the feed. Of course, we need to make a partial for feed now. Yeah, so an error there because the feed partial isn't defined. So let's go here. And the feed should render if there are any feed items. It's going to be an ordered list. Let's give it class microposts. Let's render the feed items. And let's paginate them too. Save that and see how we're doing. We're pretty red there. Let's see what happened. Something is definitely very wrong. Up to syntax error though, that should be easy to fix. Right, I just didn't close this off. There we go. This feed is now working. There's something a little mysterious though. Let's take a look at this partial. So here we got render at feed items. How does Rails know how to render that thing? We've talked about this before, but this is a really good application of it. So what is the class of each of these feed items? Well, each feed item is a member of this collection here. Static pages controller. So what Rails is doing here is it's seeing that this is a collection of feed items. It's saying, well, I should call a partial on each of these items. And it knows because the class of each item is a micropost to look for a template called _micropost in the micropost views folder. So that's why this is just working. It's because we defined this micropost view, or this micropost partial. So before we had an instance variable called @micropost when we were rendering these things on the show page, like here. Right here. But this variable name is irrelevant. What matters is the class of each object in this collection. Let's run our test suite to make sure we're green. That's great. There's actually one subtlety left. If we go here to the home page and submit an invalid micropost, say one that's blank, we get this error. Let's see where this is coming from. This is in the static pages controller. No, it's actually in the micropost controller. You can see here the URL is /micropost. So this is the create action in the micropost controller. Right, so what's happening here is that this micropost is not valid. So @micropost.save is false. So it's falling through to this right here. And this branch of the create action does not define an @feedItems variable. So it's nil, and that's why we're getting this. We're getting nil.any question mark, but there is no such method on nil. So that means we need to do something like this. Now I'm just going to do an empty array here. You can save this and see the results. Let's go back. That's weird. Did I not save that? Huh. Oh, it should go before the render. Here. Right. So what happens here is that the feed just disappears temporarily. Now that's not the best behavior. The problem is that if you were to do something obvious like this, say, oh, well, let's just paginate it. Why not just do that? That seemed to work. And the problem is that if you go down to the pagination links, they're on the microposts. You can see right down here at the bottom. They're on the microposts URL, so /micropost. If you click on this, it'll complain. So it's possible to hack around this, but at the level of this tutorial, it's just not worth the trouble. So what we're going to do is do the next best thing and just make this empty. Now that we can create microposts, let's learn how to destroy them. It's pretty straightforward given what we did in lesson 9 with users. Let's look at a mockup. all we're going to do is just add delete links. Of course, these delete links should only appear for the owner of the micropost, and we'll arrange that. Let's put this on the micropost partial right here. So after this time ago in words, let's put a link to delete. We're actually going to put it inside the same span. And we should only put the link if the current user is the user the micropost belongs to. So remember, we have a current user boolean, current user question mark, and then micropost.user, and this is if. And let's link to the word delete, link to the micropost. This is the micropost path of micropost, but we can just write that as micropost. And we want method delete. And let's give it pop-up confirmation. We did this before with users. See, that fits actually just fine. So that link should be working. Let's take a look. Oh, I forgot the closing bit here. All right, so we've got this, got the confirmation, but of course it won't actually work yet because we need a destroy action here in the micropost controller. We had something similar when we destroyed users. Here we had a correct user, the filter there. In this case, the correct user is finding by params of ID. Now we're going to find by params of ID again, except it's going to be through the association. So we'll do something like this. Correct user, and we want to say that micropost equals current user dot microposts dot find by, or we saw in the table right here. Find by the ID, the micropost ID, which is what is in params of ID. Remember, find by returns nil if this doesn't correspond to anything in the database, so we can just redirect to the root URL if the micropost is nil. Otherwise, we'll have an @micropost variable once we apply this filter. And this is only on destroy. And then inside the destroy action, we want to destroy that micropost. At micropost.destroy, and then that's going to give a flash. And now we have to decide where to redirect to. So if we look at the current design, we've got the delete link here, so you might think, oh, we can just redirect to the root URL. But remember, we also see microposts on the profile page. So it would be convenient to redirect back to the profile page if that's where we deleted from. So you might ask, is there a way to get the page that referred the delete request? So if you click here, is there a way to get the place this is being issued from? And the answer is yes. It's related to this thing we used in the sessions helper. Remember, with friendly forwarding, we remembered where people came from, request.url. It turns out this request object has something else that's really useful. It has the referring URL. So we can do redirect to the refer. And if that is nil, then we'll redirect to the root URL by default. By the way, I should mention that this part here is almost never going to happen in real life. Because even if we're on the home page, and we issue a delete request, in this case, request.refer is the home page. So the reason this is here is mainly because in some tests, this thing here, request.refer, will be nil. So let's check it out and see if it's working. Here we go, micropost deleted. Go from here. All right. You can see it redirected here to the show page, which is the right behavior. All right, adding delete links is potentially dangerous, so it's a good idea to write a test to make sure that users can only delete their own posts. And we've also added several elements to the interface here, so it would be a good idea to write an integration test to capture that behavior. Let's close things down. A bunch of tabs here. And now let's get started by editing the micropost fixtures. And let's add a few microposts for other users. This will make it easier to test the microposts. So let's go down to the end here. Actually, let's get rid of that white space. And let's add one for this user, for Archer. So that's this. Let's call it ants. Content is, oh, is that what you want? Because that's how you get ants. Need to be created at more than time.zone.now ago. So let's say it was created at 2 years ago. Oh, and we need to give it a user. And then let's put in a few more. And create a couple for a different user. We won't actually use these last two in this lesson, but we will in the next one. Now let's write a test to make sure that a user can't destroy the micropost of a different user. It's going to go in the micropost controller test. This is where we put the access control tests. So the strategy is to log in as Michael here at the top, and then try to destroy this micropost here, ants, which belongs to Archer and not to Michael. So we can use our login as helper. And then we need to assert no difference in the micropost count. If we send a delete request to the destroy action with the ID of a micropost that doesn't belong to this user. So let's say micropost of ants. When the test is read there because I haven't saved this fixtures file yet. I meant to do that, but then forgot. Let's save this again. There we go. No harm done. And with that access control test done, we're now ready to make an integration test for the MicroPost interface. Let's go here and generate that. Let's call it MicroPost interface. All right, let's open that up. We're going to want to log in as a user, so let's do this. And let's test the interface. All right, we log in as the user, and then let's get the root path. Make sure pagination is being invoked. Remember, we checked pagination on the user's profile test, so that was for the show page. Now we're going to check it for the home page. Actually, we can save this, work incrementally. All right, and so let's check. Let's just go through the things. We go to the home page. We make sure that pagination is invoked. And then let's make an invalid submission, like this. This is the MicroPost path it's being submitted to. Actually, let's put in a comment here. We post with, say, empty content. Anything invalid is fine, so let's just do this. And then this should give us that error explanation div. So that's what we expect for invalid submission. For valid submission, let's define the content. So that asserts that this actually increases the MicroPost count by 1. And in fact, if we're going to do that, we should probably do this too, just for consistency. We can add this, assert no difference here. Okay, so after we submit it successfully, we check that it changes the MicroPost count. And now we want to make sure that the content of the MicroPost appears on the resulting page. So that involves following the redirect. That's this here. We might as well assert the redirect too. And then we want the resulting response body to match the content. Let's check that. That's good. And now let's check deletion. Let's make sure that there's a delete link first. And now let's issue a delete request to the micropost path of the first micropost on the page. The difference should be 1 in the micropost count. If we issue a delete request to the micropost path of that micropost, that didn't pass. What happened? We want to delete the micropost, so it should be a difference of -1. You can see up here the difference is 2. Right? It was 40, expected actual 38. That's because it was +1 instead of -1 for a difference of 2. All right, so that's working. And now the last thing is, let's see if we go to a different user. So this is the profile. If you go to your own profile, you should see these delete links, but if you go to someone else's profile, they should disappear. So let's go to a different profile. Archer is our canonical second user. And now we want to assert that there are no delete links. So we can do this. And the way to do that is text delete. Oh, this is in quotes. This is what we did up here. Count 0. And this should not be a comma. And that's it. That's green. So let's take a look at the whole test suite. All right, so our basic microposts are now working, and they're well tested too. At this point, we have an excellent basic micropost resource with a working interface. There's just one other major feature I'd like to add, which is the ability to attach images along with micropost content. Let's take a look at a mock-up of that. Here we see the same sort of micropost feed along with the box to create a new micropost, but we also now have an upload image area and a micropost with an uploaded image. We'll start by making a basic version of this, and then we'll add some refinements. And finally, we'll make it production ready by uploading the image to Amazon S3. Our current gem file includes a gem called Carrier Wave that's used for image upload. Among other things, Carrier Wave adds a Rails generator for creating an image uploader. So let's do that now. We'll generate the uploader, and let's call it picture. I actually called it image initially, but I found that that was too generic with things like image tag and so on. But this works well. To get image upload to work, we have to add an extra attribute to the micropost model. Let's take a look at a diagram of that. Here we've got ID content user ID, created at, updated at that we had before, and then picture, which is a string. So let's generate that. A lot of this stuff, by the way, I just got out of the Carrier Wave documentation. It's not rocket science. You just Google around and it'll tell you how to do it. The default migration is fine, so just execute it. All right, now we need to do what is called mounting the uploader inside the micropost model. It goes here. Let's put it after the default scope, but before the validations. Doesn't really matter. Syntax is the name of the attribute, which is picture in this case. And then the name of the uploader class. Now it turns out this got generated when we did that Rails generate uploader. The default uploader is fine for now. We'll edit it in a moment. So this sets things up for uploading, and then we also need to edit the MicroPost form. In addition to this text field and the submit button, we need a file field. This is what you use for uploading files. The attribute is called picture. And actually, let's put this in a span. We can actually take a look at this. We probably have to restart the server here. It's a common problem. All right, there we go. We've got this choose file button. Won't actually quite work yet though, because we have to add something to this form. Oop, how did that happen? Let's move that back. Inside this form for, we need to add something called multi-part true. It's part of the HTML. Reload this. Take a look at this. You can see here we've got in the form multi-part form data right here. It's not important to know exactly where that comes from. It's just that's the thing you do in a form when you want to upload a file. Since this is another attribute we're going to be editing through the web, let's open up the MicroPost controller. And add this to the permitted parameters. So permit content and permit picture. This is the kind of thing it would be easy to forget. So if you're implementing something like this and it's just not working and you don't know why, it's probably because one of the parameters isn't permitted. Save that. And now we're ready. We just need to display it in the MicroPost partial. So right after the content here, let's just put in the image. So the content in this context, the class is actually everything inside the MicroPost. This content here is just the text. So let's put an image in here if it exists. This is image tag. And one of the things that CarrierWave gives us is the URL associated with a picture. micropost.picture.url if there's a picture. Something else that CarrierWave gives us is a Boolean. It returns true if there is a picture and false otherwise. Save that and let's see how it goes. All right, that worked. Look at that. Let's take a look at what happens if you forget this thing here in the MicroPost controller. What happens if you forget this? This is a very likely thing to happen. So that's potentially very confusing because it's just a silent failure. Over time, you'll develop an intuition for this kind of error, but this is exactly the kind of thing that is caused by forgetting something in the permitted parameters. This is a great start, and in fact, at first glance, it might look like it's done. But in fact, there's absolutely no validation on this data. And it's really important, at the very least, to limit the size of these uploads. It's also nice to limit the file name extensions to things that are actually images. In fact, CarrierWave comes with the latter of those. If we go to the picture uploader, we can go to the extension whitelist. It's right here. We can uncomment this. So that's already working. It's pretty cool. That was easy. And then in the MicroPost model, we're going to add a custom validation for the picture size. We haven't actually done this before yet. Instead of validate, it's going to be validate. singular, and then we'll give it a reference to a method we're going to run. In this case, let's call it picture size. And then let's define it. And let's see if the picture size is bigger than 5 megabytes, that'll be too big. We can do this with the megabytes method, added a fixed num. This is like 2.years.ago. If picture size greater than 5 megabytes, let's add to the errors by hand. I'm going to add it to the picture attribute. In fact, let me show you how this works with something smaller. Let's say 1 megabyte, because I actually have an image that size. Let's do this image here. It's 1.9 megabytes. So you can see here that our error messages partial displays the error that we put in here. Picture should be less than 5 megabytes. Of course, this is a lie. It really should be 1. We're going to do that. But this is really useful. We get this free functionality just by defining the right error. You might have noticed, though, that it actually did the upload. Now, there's no way to prevent that in general, but it's nice to have something on the front end, at least to make it less likely. Let's change this back to 5. So over here on the micropost form, I'm going to add a little JavaScript. It's actually jQuery. And I'm just going to paste it in because this is the kind of thing that you find on Stack Overflow and then maybe change a couple things to modify it to your needs. But it's not important to know where this comes from at this point. Just copy this, paste it in. In fact, let's just change this to 1 again. Save it. Choose File. Do this. Open. Actually, I need to refresh this, don't I? So let's try that again. And now we get this pop-up that says maximum size is 5 megabytes. So let's change it back to 5, what it actually is, so that the message is not a lie. But it's absolutely essential to understand that this is not actually secure. This will not prevent people from uploading arbitrary images if they want to. Anybody could always just disable JavaScript or edit the HTML using a JavaScript editor or issue a curl request. The only way in general to prevent this sort of thing is to put it on the back end as well. So this is just for convenience. It's really nice, but this does not actually prevent people from uploading big files. We also saw this whitelist here. There's a way to enforce that on the front end. Again, it doesn't give us any guarantee, but it just makes it less likely to happen. And that's using the accept keyword. Accept key, and then the value is just the list of the image type. So it's image JPEG. These are MIME types. So the file name extensions on something like a JPEG are commonly JPG or JPEG, but here the MIME type is actually defined as part of a standard, and it is always JPEG. That's not particularly important. I just wanted to explain why there's a slight discrepancy between this whitelist and this list of accepted MIME types. All right, these are solid validations, but we're still not quite done. Let me show you what happens. We can upload an image that's less than 5 megabytes, but it is still unacceptable. Let's choose a file here. Let's go, actually, I think I need to refresh this page. So. Okay, so choose file. Why is this grayed out? That's really weird. It should be allowing a ping. Oh, you know what? That's great. You can see what happened here. There's actually a mistake. This should say image/GIF, comma, image/ping. And this is just completely wrong here. And this shows up here. If I do choose file, you can see it's graying out the ping. That's because it's not accepting that MIME type. So if we change it, it'll work again. Image/ping. Now we want to refresh it. That's on the front end, so we have to refresh it. And then choose file. Now it'll work. So suppose I uploaded this headshot. Less than 5 megabytes, so it uploads fine. But the results are terrifying. It is possible to constrain the image display size using CSS, for example, but that doesn't actually change the size of the image. In fact, this has probably happened to you. You'll go to a website, and there will be some small image that just takes forever to render. And that's because it's not actually resized on the back end. It's just being resized with CSS. But we don't want to do that. We want to actually resize the image. Let's delete this thing. And the way to do that is with a program called ImageMagick, and in particular, Carrier Wave's MiniMagick interface. You can tell if you have ImageMagick like this. Convert is a command line utility that comes with ImageMagick, so if which convert gives you something, chances are you have ImageMagick installed. Otherwise, you can do something like this. If you're on the Cloud IDE, sudo apt-get update, and then sudo apt-get, so that's the first command. I'm not going to bother with it right now. Then sudo apt-get install ImageMagick, and then you have to do this fix missing. Luckily in production on Heroku, ImageMagick is already installed, so it'll work automatically. But in any case, once you've installed ImageMagick, you'll be ready for the next step. It's actually really simple. Let's go to the picture uploader. We just want to do this, uncomment Carrier Wave MiniMagick. We don't need either of these comments anymore. And then we're going to add a process step. And there are several different ways to process this listed in the Carrier Wave documentation. The one that we want will resize the image without stretching it or without automatically shrinking it. And it turns out the way to do that is resize to limit. And let's just standardize on a maximum size of 400 by 400. Those are pixels. Save that, and let's take a look. This is on the back end, so we don't have to refresh the page. Let's do this. And there we go, nicely resized. So now no matter how big the image is, it will be resized to something that's sensible for our application's design. This is now working locally. So you think, well, we can just deploy it to Heroku and it'll be working in production too. But unfortunately, that's not quite right. And the reason is because Heroku allows you to write files, but only to a temp directory that disappears every time the server is restarted. So we could deploy this thing, upload images, but the next time we redeployed, all the images would be gone. Moreover, Heroku is not designed for file storage. Instead, Heroku recommends using a third-party storage service, something like Amazon S3. The great thing is that Carrier Wave has an easy way to interface with something like S3 using the fog gem. Let's go back to here. You can see, choose what kind of storage to use for this uploader. So we can get rid of this comment now. And so we're going to say, if we're in production, use fog for storage, else use file storage. Get rid of the other comments here. Just clean up the file a bit. Now, in order to get this to work with the cloud storage provider, we have to configure Carrier Wave. Looks like I need to refresh it here. Oh, that's weird. Oh, you know what? I actually have to create it. All right, this is good. So this goes into place that gets started every time Rails starts up. It's what's called an initializer. And it's in config initializers. That's here, config initializers. And now we need to make an initializer for Carrier Wave. We actually made one of these before. The backtrace silencer was part of the advanced testing setup. Let's open this up. And I'm just going to paste in the configuration. It's not important to know exactly where it comes from. Again, this is the kind of thing you just copied from the documentation typically. So in production, we're going to initialize it as follows. You can see here we've got the fog credentials, and then we've got these environment variables for the access key ID, the secret access key, and the fog directory right here. You may recall from the last lesson that there were environment variables defined by Heroku for SendGrid. Look at that here. That's here in production.rb, right here. But in this case, we're actually going to have to define these ourselves. And at this point, if you want to do this deployment, you should go to Amazon S3 and sign up for an account. Let me show you a quick list of steps. There are a lot of details to follow, and I recommend relying on the Amazon documentation. But the basic idea is that you need to sign up for an Amazon Web Services account, create a user, and you can go to the Rails tutorial and find this link. Once you've created a user, you should record the access key and secret key that you get, and then create an S3 bucket with the name of your choice. I just called mine Rails tutorial. And then you need to grant read and write permission to the user that you created in step 2. So this is a little bit tricky, but this is a great exercise. And this is an industrial strength image uploader. This is not messing around. Once you've done that, you have to go to the command line like this and do Heroku config set, and then the 3 things here, the access key, secret key, and S3 bucket. So I'm going to go offline here because these are my actual S3 credentials. I don't want to put them in the screencast, but I'm going to set them up and I'll be right back.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Actually, the S3 bucket is not secret. This is publicly exposed, so I can show you this. So do that for the access key and the secret key as well, and things should be set up. So now in order to test this, we actually have to deploy this thing to production. Let's run our test suite. By the way, we don't currently have any tests for image upload, but there is an exercise on this that gives you a bunch of hints on how to proceed. And of course, the solutions manual has the actual solution. All right, we're green. Let's upload this thing. Can push up to Bitbucket. And now we're ready to deploy, reset the database, and reseed the sample data. Oops, and I realized I accidentally forgot to save this carrier wave file. So let's go back to the branch. Save it. Sometimes this happens. That's the way it goes. All right, now we can remerge, repush, and deploy. All right, our database is seeded. Let's take a look at it. All right, it looks promising. Will this work? Let's take a look. Let's look at the big one. Force Heroku to resize it. It didn't work. Let's look at the Heroku logs to see why not. Oh, it's complaining that there's no such bucket called Rails tutorial. Let me quick check my configuration settings at S3.
Let's all go to the lobby.
Turns out my bucket's actually called this, ruby-on-rails-tutorial, so I can reset that. I don't actually have to change anything in the application, it's just an environment variable at Heroku. Let's go do this. Oops, I thought I copied that. Copy this, paste here. And I don't even have to redeploy, there's nothing to redeploy. This should have just worked, so let's take a look. In fact, I could even probably just refresh this. And there we go. Image upload in production. This image is now stored at Amazon S3 instead of the local disk, and it's been automatically resized on the back end. And of course, we also see here that the text is working, the delete links work, and so on and so forth. So everything in our interface is working in production, and we're now ready to move on to the final step. There's only one big feature left in our sample application, which is a social layer that lets users follow each other, resulting in a feed of the microposts of the followed users. We'll learn how to model these kinds of user relationships and see their implications for the micropost feed in the next lesson.